The Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulger. Chapter 5, Part 6. By degrees, however, they recovered and orders were issued to half a dozen serving men who, not being gorged, were in good marching condition to set out for the shore and bring a supply of the shellfish to appease my hunger, which by this time had really set its teeth in my vitals. Meanwhile, Bulger and I were conducted to a neat bamboo dwelling with an umbrella shaped roof, and left to ourselves until the supply of food should arrive. I was too hungry to sleep, and Bulger too was in the same condition. But he was patience itself, as he always is when he knows that his little master is suffering. I threw myself down on a heap of dried rushes, and my loving companion came and pillowed his head on my arm. After a tedious wait of an hour or so, a great outcry told me that something unusual had happened in the village of the Wind Eaters. It was the arrival of the serving men bringing the supply of oysters. I could hardly restrain myself until Chief Switch should summon me to break my long fast. When I reached the chief's quarters, I found a vast crowd of people assembled to see the lump man put solid things down his throat. Chief Switch and his court occupied front seats. As you know by this time, the voice of a wind eater depends upon the condition he is in. If he has just eaten and his body is rounded out like a well-filled balloon, his voice is deep and rumbling. If, on the other hand, he has not taken food for a day or so, and his skin hangs in folds and wrinkles on his framework of bones, he speaks with a soft, flute-like tone. As I stepped to the front, followed by Bulger, and took my place beside the heap of oysters, a deafening outcry went up, in which the deep roars of the inflated wind eaters were mingled with the soft, flute-like tones of the fasting ones. Not noticing any instrument at hand with which to pry the shells open, I thoughtlessly drew out my poniard from its sheath. In an instant, a terrible panic seized upon the assembled multitude. Queen Fuyu and Princess Pufa fell into a swoon. Chief Switch, being in a fasting condition, darted away to his apartments like a phantom. The Minister of State, Hissa, Wurwur, and Shaboom, being puffed up to their fullest capacity, struck the ground with their feet and rolled out of the way like huge footballs. Quick as thought, I sheathed my dagger, the sight of whose glinting point had brought about all this consternation. And, profiting by the lessons given me at our first meeting by Go-Wiz and his companions, I began a series of head duckings and walking beam motions of my body, which soon restored confidence in my peaceful intentions and brought my scattered audience back to their seats. Go-Wiz, who had run the farthest, was now loudest in his boast that he had not been the least frightened. Chief Swish resumed his seat with considerable nerve, but I noticed that he kept his eyes fastened on the place where I had hidden my dagger in my belt. Although the sight of the toothsome oysters only served to whet my appetite, yet was I now terribly perplexed to know how I should pry the shells open, for the laws of the land of the wind eaters visit the death penalty upon anyone found with a sharp-pointed instrument in his possession. In earliest childhood, the fingernails are kept pared down to the flesh until they lose their power to grow hard, and their place is taken by a piece of tough skin. Teeth, the wind eaters have none, or more correctly speaking, their teeth do not grow above their gums. Nature seemed to have gradually ceased taking the trouble to supply these people with something for which they had absolutely no use. You must bear in mind that these curious people had always been satisfied with such thin diet. In ancient times, so Chief Swish informed me, their ancestors had been fruit eaters. The fruits, however, failing, they had been forced to have recourse to the gums which flowed from the trees, and as these gradually dried up, they made discovery that the various winds which blew across the island were filled with some invisible germs or particles which had the power of sustaining life. To resume, observing a flint hatchet lying on the ground, I laid hold of it and set to work opening one of the largest oysters. A deep silence settled upon the assemblage. With a skillful twist, I wrenched the upper shell off, and raising the lower one, upon which the fat and luscious creature lay unmindful of his impending fate, I opened my mouth and gracefully let the dainty morsel slip out of sight. 100 cries of half horror, half wonder broke like a chorus from the surrounding crowds of wind eaters. Again and again this outburst died away, only to break forth once more with redoubled vigor. Many of the lookers-on were made so serious ill by this, to them, most extraordinary spectacle, that they hastily left the place before I was able to take a second mouthful. You may fancy how they felt, about as you would were I to begin gulping down bits of stone and iron. Queen Puyu clung timorously to her husband's arm, but the Princess Poofa stepped boldly nearer to me, so that she might have a better view of the little man solid all through. Again I raised one of the largest shells and let its occupant slip noiselessly down my throat, not forgetting each time to loosen the white muscle which held the shells together for Bulger's share of the feast. Gradually, the qualm of the wind eaters at sight of a human being swallowing food in lumps gave place to a devouring curiosity on their part to draw nearer and get a better view of my manner of satisfying hunger. I could understand enough to know that many of the wind eaters had serious doubts that I really swallowed the oysters. To them, I was little less than some sort of sleight of hand man or doer of tricks. The little Princess Poofa mounted upon one of the benches, and the instant the oyster disappeared down my throat, insisted upon my opening my mouth to its greatest width, in order that she might take a look for herself and see if the oyster were not hidden away under my tongue or in my cheek somewhere. A sudden scream of terror startled the lookers-on as much as it did me. The little princess was carried away in a swoon. It was my teeth. They had frightened the gentle Poofa half to death. For a moment, all was confusion. Encouraged by Go Wiz, many of the wind eaters seized their clubs and pressed forward with murderous intent. The reappearance of Princess Poofa, bright and smiling, set everything right again. Now the crowd was seized with an unconquerable curiosity to draw near and take a look for themselves at the terrible thing which had thrown Poofa into a swoon. My jaws soon began to ache from stretching my mouth wide open enough to give each one of them a glance at my double row of ivory cutters and grinders. And if I do say it myself, I had in those days one of the finest sets of teeth that ever cut their way through a slice of Menberg biscuit or ground up a piece of German roast goose. From now on, these childlike and simple-minded people became pretty thoroughly convinced that the little man thick all through was a kind and peaceful creature and every way perfectly harmless. The children flocked about me and, encouraged by my smiles and head duckings, soon made friends with me. I was glad of this, for I was anxious to make a close study of the wind eaters young and old. You may judge of my surprise when I saw a bevy of these children, animated puffballs that they were, engaged in the to them novel sport of rushing full tilt at me and bouncing off like rubber balls from a board fence. Well, I suppose you were bursting with curiosity to hear something more definite about these strange people. To me, they were not entirely unknown. I had read here and there ancient books of travel by Arabian authors of some such a race, whose bodies were so frail that they were unable to partake of any stronger and heavier food than the sweet gums which flowed from the trees, and whose skins were so transparent that they were called glass-bodied, the beating of their little hearts being plainly visible to the eye of the beholder. I have no doubt that these authors referred to the dwellers of this wonderful island, on which no fruits, berries, or edible roots were to be found, and whose ancestors, as I was informed by Chief Zwitz, did in former ages thus sustain their lives. But I must confess that the fact that there were in existence human beings who literally lived upon air or more correctly speaking, upon winds laden with some invisible particles of life sustaining matter, was a little more than I had ever dared to dream out, even in the most active workings of my imagination. You may judge then of my delight upon finding myself among these extraordinary people, and upon discovering them to be such true children of nature, mild mannered and peacefully inclined. And yet, I was not long in making a discovery which proved to be quite an important one to me. It was this: I learned that although the truth was as I have stated it, that the wind eaters are, as a rule, a race of peace loving creatures, gentle in their dispositions and averse to wrongdoing, yet there were exceptions to this general rule. Strange to say, it depended on what wind they fed upon. All the women, for instance, were gentleness itself. They fed upon the soft zephyrs of the south. But the great majority of these people contented themselves with satisfying their hunger by resorting to the strong and wholesome west wind, while a goodly number, from some idea that it had a sweeter and more delicate flavor, a sort of heavy nut-like taste, preferred the fitful, irregular east wind. It was, however, not considered wholesome diet by the best physicians of the nation, and they contended that those who made a habit of feeding upon this wind were never as hale and hearty as those who restricted themselves entirely to the nutritious, embracing west wind. A few there were, as in every land there are those who delight in strong, rich food, who insisted upon feeding on the rugged, gusty northwest wind, claiming that it was best suited to their wants and that nature had intended man to partake of a wind powerful and strong-bodied in order to fit them for the battle of life. There were even some, a very few, be it said to the honor of these mild-mannered and peace-loving people, who, contrary to the laws of the land and the express commands of Chief Switch Switch, welcomed the blowing of the angry, whistling, boisterous north wind, and drank in the dangerous fluid until their better natures were completely changed. And from being gentle, timorous, and peace-loving, they became rough and quarrelsome. To this ilk belonged Captain Go-Wiz. In fact, as I was told by Wurwur, Chief Zwishwish himself showed signs of fear when he saw Go-Wiz come swaggering into the village, his eyes inflamed, his steps unsteady, his speech indistinct after a heavy meal upon the rude and buffeting wind of the north. While in this condition, Go-Wiz lost the slight control he had over himself, and had, upon one occasion, so far forgotten himself as to breathe out threats and defiance against Chief Switch Switch, driving that ruler out of his own apartments by advancing upon him with a bit of flint which he had ground to a dangerously sharp point. Such were the curious people among whom I now found myself sojourning, and on terms of pleasant intimacy with their ruler. A few days after my arrival at the village of the Wind Eaters, I was unfortunately the innocent cause of rather a grave accident, which for a while had the effect of making me somewhat unpopular at the court of Chief Switch Switch. It all came about in this way. I've already told you how quick the children were to discover the solidity of my body, and what delight they took in throwing themselves against me full tilt in order to have the sport of bouncing off again like so many rubber balls. Now you must keep in mind the fact that even after a hearty meal, a whole dozen of these babies weighs but about 1 good pound. I used to encourage them to play about me in order to better observe their curious tricks and ways, one of which was to lock arms and legs and thus form a chain of human links, one of which being fastened to a peak of the roof and the other possibly to some high staff or pole, at times even extending across the street and ending on the roof of the opposite dwelling. Thus festooned, they spent hours swaying to and fro in the cool of the day, often swinging themselves to sleep. And it was not at all an unusual thing to see one of the mothers in search of her child come bustling along, halt, take down the line of living links, unhook her baby, replace the line, and hurry away home. While seated one day on the balcony of one of Chief Switch's cottages, a dozen or more of the children set to work to form such a chain, one end of it being fastened to one of my earrings, which, like a good sailor, I took pleasure in wearing at times, and the other reaching nearly to the ground, passing over the high rail of the balcony. Scrambling, pushing, and squirming, uttering the queerest cries, shouts, and squeals, these tiny wind eaters were half wild with joy, when suddenly one of those nearest me swung against the point of a needle which I had doubtlessly thrust into the lapel of my coat the last time I had been doing some mending, for like a true sailor, I was skilled in the use of needle and thread. I was aroused from my dreamy contemplation of these fantastic beings by a sharp crack, like that made by the bursting of a toy balloon. Again and again the same sharp noise rang in my ear. A glance was sufficient to explain it all. I could feel my hair bristling up with horror as I saw the living links of this chain snap asunder, one after the other, and disappear into thin air, exploded by coming into contact with the needlepoint. The force of the explosion of the first of these tiny puffballs of humanity had been sufficient to burst the baby next in line, and so on to the end of the chain. A dozen of them gone in less than as many seconds, and not so much as a lock of hair to carry home to the heartbroken mothers. And we'll pause here and we'll continue with the story in the next video. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.